The story you were never supposed to hear is not that Christianity was slowly corrupted over centuries, but that it was violently redirected in plain sight by power, politics, and fear. And that one Roman emperor, standing at the crossroads of empire and belief, permanently altered how billions would understand God, Jesus, salvation, and truth. Constantine did not merely legalize Christianity, as the textbooks politely say. He stepped into a fractured religious movement, selected which voices would survive, which beliefs would be labeled heresy, and which version of Jesus would become law. What followed was not a spiritual revival, but the birth of an institution that fused Roman authority with religious doctrine so tightly that questioning it would eventually become a crime against both God and state. This is not conspiracy. This is documented history, uncomfortable, unsettling, and deliberately softened by tradition. To understand Constantine's role, we have to strip away the halo placed over him by later church historians and return to the brutal realities of the 4th century Roman world. Constantine was not raised Christian. He was a soldier emperor shaped by war, ambition, and the ruthless logic of imperial survival. Rome was collapsing under internal division, economic strain, and constant power struggles. Religion was not a private matter. It was a tool of unity or rebellion. The empire had always tolerated multiple gods, but it demanded loyalty to Rome above all else. Christianity, with its exclusive allegiance to one god and its refusal to worship the emperor, had long been viewed as a destabilizing force. Before Constantine, Christians were persecuted not because they were immoral, but because they were uncontrollable. When Constantine rose to power, Christianity was already deeply divided. There was no single Christianity. There were Jewish followers of Jesus who still kept Torah, Greek-speaking Christians influenced by Platonic philosophy, communities that believed Jesus was a divine being, others who believed he was fully human and chosen by God, and still others who rejected the idea of a Trinity entirely. These groups argued fiercely over scripture, authority, and doctrine. There was no unified Bible, no centralized church, and no agreed-upon theology. This chaos was a problem for an emperor who needed ideological unity to stabilize his rule. The famous story of Constantine's conversion begins with a vision before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in 312 CE. According to later Christian sources, Constantine saw a symbol in the sky, often described as a cross or the Chi-Rho, along with the phrase, "In this sign, conquer." What is often ignored is that Constantine did not immediately abandon paganism after this event. Coins minted during his reign continued to depict the sun god Sol Invictus for years. He retained the title Pontifex Maximus, the high priest of Rome's pagan religion. His conversion was gradual, politically useful, and strategically ambiguous. This matters because it reveals motive. Constantine did not embrace Christianity because he was persuaded by Jesus' teachings on humility, enemy love, or self-sacrifice. He embraced it because Christianity, if unified and controlled, could become the ideological glue Rome desperately needed. A single god mirrored a single emperor. A universal church mirrored a universal empire. Orthodoxy could replace rebellion. One of Constantine's most consequential actions was not theological at first glance, but administrative. He granted bishops imperial authority, wealth, and legal power. Church leaders suddenly had political incentive to align doctrine with imperial favor. Disagreements that were once resolved through debate and scripture now had state-backed consequences. Theology became law. Dissent became treason. This shift fundamentally changed the nature of Christian belief. In the New Testament, truth is discerned through scripture, reason, and communal testing. After Constantine, truth increasingly flowed from councils sanctioned by imperial power. The most famous of these was the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. Contrary to popular myth, Constantine did not personally decide which books belonged in the Bible at Nicaea. But he did something arguably more influential. He demanded doctrinal unity under threat of exile. The central issue at Nicaea was the nature of Jesus. Was he eternally divine, co-equal with God, or was he a created being exalted by God? This debate was not minor. It shaped how salvation, worship, and authority would be understood. Arius, a presbyter from Alexandria, argued that Jesus was not eternal in the same way as God. His views were widely popular and biblically grounded, drawing from passages like John 14:28, where Jesus says, "The Father is greater than I." His opponents argued for a more metaphysical, philosophically complex understanding of Christ's divinity. Constantine did not enter this debate as a theologian. He entered as an emperor tired of unrest. He wanted agreement, not nuance. The Nicene Creed that emerged was not simply a theological statement. It was a political compromise enforced by power. Those who refused to sign were exiled. Their writings were burned. History, from that moment on, would be written by the winners. This raises a crucial reflection question. If truth is determined by imperial enforcement rather than scriptural coherence, can it still be called biblical? The answer, uncomfortable as it is, lies in the consequences. After Nicaea, Christianity began to resemble Rome more than Jesus. Hierarchies hardened. Authority flowed downward. Violence, once rejected by early Christians, became justified in the name of orthodoxy. The kingdom not of this world was now deeply entangled with worldly power. It is important to be precise here and not exaggerate. Constantine did not invent Christianity from nothing. He did not personally write doctrine or scripture, but he created the conditions in which one version of Christianity could dominate all others permanently. He transformed a persecuted, decentralized movement into a state-sponsored institution. And institutions, once formed, prioritized survival over truth. One subtle but profound change under Constantine was the shift in how scripture was used. In the earliest Christian communities, scripture was debated openly. Letters were circulated, questioned, and interpreted within living communities. After Constantine, interpretation increasingly became the domain of elites. Literacy, access, and authority narrowed. The Bible was no longer primarily a tool for discernment, but a weapon for enforcement. Even the concept of heresy changed. In the New Testament, false teaching is confronted through argument and correction. After Constantine, heresy became something to be eradicated. This is not a coincidence. When belief becomes tied to state stability, disagreement becomes dangerous. Another often overlooked aspect of Constantine's influence is how Christian time, space, and symbols were reshaped. Sunday worship aligned conveniently with sun worship traditions. Pagan temples were repurposed rather than abandoned. Christian festivals absorbed and rebranded existing Roman celebrations. This was not necessarily malicious, but it further blurred the line between biblical faith and imperial culture. At this point, it's fair to ask, does acknowledging Constantine's role mean Christianity itself is false? No, that would be an oversimplification. What it means is that modern Christianity is not identical to early Christianity. The Jesus of the Gospels, who rejected political power, warned against religious elites, and announced a kingdom that subverted empire, does not fit comfortably within a system built by an emperor. This is where many churches grow silent. Because once you see this historical pivot clearly, you are forced to separate Jesus from the institution that claims to represent him. You are forced to ask whether doctrines handed down through councils and creeds always reflect Scripture, or whether they sometimes reflect the priorities of empire. Here is the engagement I'll ask, and only briefly. If you value honest, evidence-based examination of Scripture and history, not tradition for tradition's sake, support this work so more people can encounter the Bible without filters. As we move deeper, the evidence will become more specific, more textual, and more challenging. Constantine's influence did not end with Nicaea. It extended into how the Bible was transmitted, how authority was defined, how salvation was framed, and how dissent was punished. None of this requires speculation. It requires the courage to look directly at history, without assuming the church has always told the full story. The real question is not whether Constantine changed Christianity. The historical record makes that unavoidable. The real question is whether followers of Jesus are willing to disentangle the faith of the New Testament from the machinery of empire that still shapes it today. Once Christianity became useful to the empire, The definition of true faith began to shift in ways that were subtle enough to feel spiritual, yet structural enough to permanently reshape belief. Under Constantine, unity was no longer something that emerged organically from shared conviction. It became something imposed for the sake of order. This is where many modern misunderstandings begin, because later generations were taught to see this moment as Christianity finally winning, when in reality, it was Christianity being repurposed. The church gained protection, wealth, and influence, but it paid a price that few were willing to name: its independence from political power. After Nicaea, Constantine did not step back and allow theology to develop freely. He actively intervened in church disputes across the empire, exiling bishops one year and recalling them the next when political calculations changed. Even Arius himself, condemned at Nicaea, was later invited back from exile when Constantine sought reconciliation. This alone should challenge the idea that the council's decisions were purely spiritual or final. Doctrine was flexible when unity demanded it. Truth became negotiable when stability was at risk. What began to crystallize during this period was a new understanding of authority. In the New Testament, authority is rooted in faithfulness to Jesus' teachings and alignment with Scripture. Leaders are servants, not rulers. But as bishops gained imperial backing, authority increasingly flowed from position rather than character or scriptural reasoning. This was not merely a leadership shift. It altered how Christians related to God. Obedience to church hierarchy gradually became intertwined with obedience to God Himself. This fusion of church and state also transformed the way salvation was framed. Early Christian writings emphasize allegiance to Jesus as Lord in contrast to Caesar as Lord. This confession was inherently political, even when it avoided violence. Under Constantine, that tension evaporated. Caesar now endorsed Jesus, and Jesus was preached in ways that supported imperial order. The radical edge of the gospel, its critique of wealth, power, and domination, became dulled. Salvation was increasingly discussed in abstract metaphysical terms rather than as a lived resistance to injustice and idolatry. One of the most enduring effects of Constantine's reign was the normalization of theological uniformity. Diversity of interpretation, once expected and even valued, came to be seen as a threat. This had direct consequences for which Christian texts survived and which faded into obscurity. While Constantine did not personally compile the biblical canon, his reign created the conditions in which canonization became urgent. A unified empire required a unified scripture, or at least the appearance of one. By the mid-4th century, Christian communities were already treating certain writings as authoritative and others as suspect. Texts associated with groups labeled heretical were marginalized, not necessarily because they lacked apostolic origin, but because they supported theological views now deemed dangerous. This is not to say suppressed texts were automatically true or inspired. It is to say that the process was not neutral. Power shaped preservation. The gradual disappearance of alternative Christian voices created the illusion of inevitability. Later believers inherited a curated tradition and assumed it had always been that way. Very few were encouraged to ask why certain debates vanished, why some interpretations were declared unthinkable, or why questioning creeds became synonymous with questioning God. This leads to another reflection worth confronting honestly. If God's truth is unchanging, why did its official expression require imperial enforcement to survive? The answer is uncomfortable, but revealing. Truth does not need coercion. Institutions do. Constantine's policies also reshaped Christian ethics. Prior to his reign, Christian resistance to military service and violence was common. Jesus' commands to love enemies and reject retaliation were taken seriously, even when costly. After Christianity aligned with the empire, these teachings became inconvenient. New theological justifications emerged to reconcile Jesus' words with imperial warfare. What had once been a persecuted pacifist movement began producing arguments for just war. Another significant development was the elevation of orthodoxy over orthopraxy. In the Gospels, Jesus consistently prioritizes how people live over what they claim to believe. In the post-Constantinian church, correct belief increasingly overshadowed ethical practice. Creeds became tests of loyalty. Moral failure could be forgiven, but doctrinal deviation could get you expelled, exiled, or worse. This inversion would have lasting consequences for how Christianity was experienced and enforced. It is crucial to emphasize again that none of this requires conspiracy theories or secret plots. The sources are largely church historians themselves, Eusebius foremost among them, who praised Constantine openly and framed his actions as divine providence. What they did not do was critically examine how power reshaped faith. That task falls to later readers willing to read history without reverence. Here is the engagement request for this section. Kept simple. If this kind of unfiltered biblical and historical examination matters to you, make sure this work reaches others who are quietly asking the same questions. As the institutional church solidified, something else quietly faded. The expectation that ordinary believers could meaningfully interpret Scripture for themselves. Clerical authority grew. Access narrowed. Over time, this would culminate in centuries where the Bible was functionally inaccessible to most Christians, not because God withheld it, but because institutions guarded it. The tragedy is not that Constantine supported Christianity. The tragedy is that Christianity learned to rely on Constantine. From that moment on, faith and power became entangled in ways that would echo through crusades, inquisitions, forced conversions, and doctrinal rigidity. The seed was planted early, watered by good intentions and political necessity. Yet even within this transformed landscape, the words of Jesus remained stubbornly subversive. They survived creeds, councils, and empires. They continued to challenge the very structures built in his name. And that tension between the Jesus of Scripture and the Christianity shaped by empire is the tension that still defines modern faith. The answer to whether Constantine created modern Christianity is not a simple yes or no. He did not invent belief, but he engineered the framework through which belief would be controlled, taught, and enforced. Understanding this does not destroy faith, it clarifies it. It forces a distinction between devotion to Christ and loyalty to tradition. And that distinction is where the real uncovering begins. As the Constantinian framework settled into place, Christianity began to experience something it had never possessed before: memory shaped by authority. History was no longer simply remembered. It was organized, edited, and preserved through institutions that now had a vested interest in presenting the past as a straight line leading inevitably to their present power. This is where modern believers often underestimate the influence of Constantine's era, because its most lasting impact was not theological formulas, but historical amnesia. Church historians writing after Constantine, especially those who benefited from imperial favor, framed earlier Christian diversity as confusion that God mercifully resolved through councils and emperors. This narrative subtly trained believers to distrust plurality and equate unity with divine approval. But when we read the New Testament carefully, unity is grounded in love, humility, and shared allegiance to Christ, not in forced agreement on metaphysical definitions. The difference is not small. It marks the transition from relational faith to regulated religion. One of the clearest examples of this shift can be seen in how Jesus himself was increasingly interpreted. In the Gospels, Jesus consistently resists being made a political figure. He refuses to seize power, avoids messianic spectacle, and warns his followers about lording authority over others. Yet in post-Constantinian Christianity, Jesus becomes a cosmic ruler whose authority conveniently mirrors imperial structures. Kingship language, once subversive, is domesticated. Christ reigns, and the emperor rules in his name. This reinterpretation did not require falsifying Scripture. It required emphasizing certain themes while muting others. Passages about obedience, order, and divine sovereignty were elevated, while Jesus' critiques of wealth, religious hypocrisy, and power were softened. The Bible remained intact, but its voice was rearranged. This is how distortion often works, not through invention, but through selective amplification. Another significant development during this period was the growing distance between Christianity and its Jewish roots. Early followers of Jesus understood him within the framework of Jewish messianic expectation. He was the fulfillment of Israel's story, not the replacement of it. As Christianity aligned with Roman identity, however, Jewish practices and interpretations became liabilities. Distancing from Judaism helped Christianity appear less foreign and more compatible with imperial culture. This distancing was not merely cultural, it became theological. Jewish law was increasingly portrayed as legalistic and obsolete, often in ways that ignored Jesus' own reverence for the Hebrew scriptures. Anti-Jewish rhetoric, largely absent from the earliest Christian writings, gained traction as Christianity sought to define itself over and against Judaism rather than as a movement within it. This shift would have devastating consequences for centuries to come. The question worth asking here is simple but piercing. If Jesus was a Jewish teacher who affirmed the Hebrew scriptures, why did his followers feel the need to sever that connection to gain power? The answer again points to empire. Rome had no interest in preserving Jewish identity or theology. A Christianity detached from Judaism was easier to universalize, regulate, and control. As doctrine hardened, so did boundaries. Baptism, once a public declaration of allegiance to Jesus, became increasingly regulated by clerical authority. The Lord's Supper, originally a communal meal symbolizing unity, evolved into a ritual administered exclusively by authorized leaders. These changes were gradual, but they reinforced a growing divide between clergy and laity. Access to God began to feel mediated rather than shared. This shift also altered how suffering was understood. Early Christians viewed suffering as a consequence of faithfulness in a hostile world. It was not glorified, but it was expected. After Christianity gained imperial favor, suffering took on a different meaning. Martyrdom declined, but theological explanations for suffering multiplied. Instead of asking how power contributed to injustice, believers were encouraged to interpret hardship primarily as divine testing or mystery. Such interpretations were not inherently false, but they were incomplete. They subtly redirected attention away from systemic injustice, often perpetuated by Christian rulers themselves, and toward individual endurance. This reframing protected the institution from critique while maintaining a spiritualized narrative of faith. Another lasting consequence of the Constantinian turn was the emergence of creed-centered identity. Belonging was now defined less by following Jesus' way of life and more by assenting to officially sanctioned beliefs. Creeds served a practical purpose, but they also functioned as boundaries. Once defined, they were rarely revisited, even when new questions arose. Doubt became dangerous. Here is the reflection question for this section, and it deserves honest consideration. If Jesus welcomed questions, challenges, and dialogue, why did his church become increasingly threatened by them? The answer lies not in scripture, but in history. Institutions fear instability. Faith, when healthy, does not. For engagement, briefly and plainly, if you believe faith should withstand honest questioning rather than suppress it, support this work so it continues reaching those searching quietly for clarity. As the 4th and 5th centuries progressed, the Constantinian model became normal. Christians born into this system could scarcely imagine another way. The fusion of faith and power felt ancient, even though it was relatively new. Over time, this normalization made it harder to distinguish between what Jesus taught and what the empire required. Yet cracks remained. Monastic movements emerged partly as a protest against the institutional church's comfort and compromise. These communities sought to reclaim simplicity, discipline, and devotion outside imperial structures. Their existence itself testifies that many believers recognized something had been lost. This tension between institutional Christianity and radical discipleship would persist through every era. But the foundation laid under Constantine ensured that the institution would almost always have the upper hand. Scripture would be read through creeds, Jesus would be preached through hierarchy, and truth would be guarded by those in power. Understanding this does not require rejecting Christianity. It requires distinguishing between the message and the machine that carries it. Constantine did not silence Jesus. but he ensured that Jesus would almost always be heard through the voice of empire. By the time Constantine's model of Christianity became embedded across the Roman world, its influence was no longer limited to theology or church structure. It began reshaping how truth itself was perceived. In the biblical world, truth is something revealed, tested, wrestled with, and lived out. In the Constantinian system, truth increasingly became something defined, guarded, and enforced. This shift subtly trained believers to trust authority before evidence, tradition before text, and consensus before conscience. One of the most significant casualties of this transformation was the practice of interpretation. Early Christian communities engaged Scripture dialogically. Letters were read aloud, questioned, and discussed. Meaning emerged through collective discernment. After Christianity aligned with imperial power, interpretation narrowed. Official readings were promoted. Alternative interpretations were discouraged, not always because they were wrong, but because they were destabilizing. This narrowing of interpretation had a chilling effect on theological creativity. Once certain formulations were declared settled, exploration became suspect. The Bible, paradoxically, was treated as both sacred and dangerous. Sacred in that it was authoritative, dangerous in that uncontrolled reading might lead to dissent. This tension explains why later centuries would restrict access to Scripture, sometimes under the claim of protection, other times under the claim of purity. Constantine's legacy is also visible in how the Church began to conceptualize God. The God of the Hebrew Scriptures reveals himself through narrative, covenant, and action in history. He is known by what he does and how he relates. In post-Constantinian theology, influenced by Greek philosophical categories and imperial preference for abstraction, God increasingly became defined by metaphysical attributes. These discussions were not illegitimate, but they often overshadowed the relational and ethical dimensions emphasized in Scripture. This philosophical turn affected how Jesus was preached. Rather than focusing primarily on his teachings, actions, and prophetic challenge, emphasis shifted toward his nature, essence, and ontological status. Again, these questions mattered, but the imbalance was significant. Christianity became more about believing the right things about Jesus than living the way Jesus lived. Here, the reflection question emerges naturally. If correct belief becomes more important than transformed life, what kind of faith does that produce? History offers the answer. It produces a faith that can coexist comfortably with injustice as long as doctrinal boxes are checked. As Christianity expanded under imperial protection, it also absorbed imperial assumptions about order and control. Uniformity was equated with health. Difference was equated with danger. This mindset would later justify coercion in the name of salvation. Forced conversions, suppression of minority beliefs, and eventually violence could all be rationalized as necessary for preserving truth. None of this happened because Christians suddenly became evil. It happened because power changes incentives. When belief grants access to privilege, belief becomes a gate to be guarded. When institutions grow large, dissent feels threatening. Constantine did not invent these dynamics, but he activated them within Christianity. Another profound shift occurred in the Church's relationship to suffering and powerlessness. Jesus consistently identifies with the marginalized. His kingdom belongs to the poor, the meek, and the persecuted. Under Constantine, Christianity became the religion of the powerful. The poor were still cared for, but no longer central. The persecuted were remembered, but no longer representative. This reversal affected spiritual imagination. Instead of asking how faith challenges power, believers were taught to ask how faith supports order. Instead of seeing the cross as a symbol of state violence exposing injustice, it became a symbol of divine sanction. The instrument of execution used by Rome was transformed into the emblem of Roman Christianity. The irony is staggering, yet rarely examined. This moment forces another uncomfortable realization. Symbols change meaning depending on who controls them. The cross in the hands of the oppressed speaks differently than the cross atop imperial banners. Constantine understood this intuitively. By adopting the symbol of Christianity, he redefined it. For engagement here, briefly. If you believe symbols, doctrines, and traditions should always be re-examined in light of Scripture, not shielded from scrutiny, help this work reach others asking the same questions. As the Constantinian Church matured, it also developed mechanisms for preserving itself across generations. Education, liturgy, and catechism standardized belief. This provided continuity, but it also locked in assumptions shaped by empire. Children were taught inherited interpretations before they encountered Scripture directly. Over time, these interpretations felt biblical simply because they were familiar. What is often missing from modern teaching is the awareness that alternative Christianities once existed, not fringe cults, but mainstream communities with different emphases and interpretations. Their disappearance is not proof of error, it is evidence of exclusion. History does not remember every voice equally. It remembers those backed by power. This does not mean all suppressed views were correct. It means the process was not purely theological. Recognizing this should not lead to cynicism, but humility. If the Church has been wrong before in how it wielded authority, it can be wrong again. By the end of the 4th century, Christianity had become inseparable from Roman identity. To be a good citizen increasingly meant being a good Christian. This fusion would later reverse, where being a good Christian meant supporting political power. The line between faith and allegiance blurred beyond recognition. And yet, beneath all of this, the New Testament remained. Quiet, persistent, waiting. Its words still challenged hierarchy, warned against religious hypocrisy, and proclaimed a kingdom unlike any empire. The question was no longer whether those words existed, but whether believers were willing to hear them without the filter of tradition. Constantine did not silence Scripture, but he ensured that it would almost always be read through the assumptions of power. Understanding this is not about tearing faith down. It is about clearing the fog so the text can speak again on its own terms. As the Constantinian model hardened into tradition, something even more subtle occurred: the reinterpretation of conscience. In the earliest Christian writings, conscience is sacred. Believers are urged to examine themselves, test teachings, and hold fast to what is good. Paul praises discernment, not blind obedience. But once Christianity became institutionally aligned with empire, conscience increasingly became subordinate to orthodoxy. To disagree was no longer merely to think differently, it was to rebel. This transformation altered how doubt was treated. In the New Testament, doubt is not condemned outright. Thomas doubts and is invited to see. Questions are asked openly. Even the disciples misunderstand Jesus repeatedly without being expelled. In post-Constantinian Christianity, doubt gradually became suspect. Certainty was prized because certainty preserved order. Ambiguity threatened unity. The cost of this shift cannot be overstated. When faith discourages questioning, it no longer grows through truth-seeking, but through repetition. Belief becomes inherited rather than discovered. Scripture becomes quoted rather than wrestled with. Over time, this creates generations of believers who are confident in doctrine but disconnected from the text itself. Another area profoundly reshaped by Constantine's legacy is the understanding of hell, judgment, and fear. Early Christian teaching about judgment is complex and varied, rooted in Jewish apocalyptic imagery and ethical accountability. After Christianity became a tool of social cohesion, fear-based teaching gained utility. Hell became less about divine justice and more about control. The threat of eternal punishment reinforced conformity when persuasion failed. This does not mean early Christians denied judgment, nor does it mean later teachings were fabricated. It means emphasis shifted. Certain interpretations were amplified because they produced obedience. Fear is a powerful stabilizer, especially when combined with authority claiming divine mandate. Here, the reflection question becomes unavoidable. If fear produces outward conformity, but inward resentment or confusion, does it reflect the heart of Jesus' message? The Gospels consistently answer no. Jesus draws people through truth and love, not coercion. As Constantine's legacy passed into medieval Christianity, the structures he helped normalize intensified. The church became not only a spiritual authority, but a political power broker. Kings ruled by divine right. Wars were sanctified. Scripture was invoked to justify actions that directly contradicted Jesus' teachings on violence, humility, and mercy. These later developments cannot be blamed solely on Constantine, but they cannot be understood without him. One of the most enduring consequences of this trajectory is the confusion between Christianity and Western civilization. Many modern believers unconsciously equate biblical faith with cultural dominance. This mindset traces directly back to the moment Christianity stopped being a marginal movement and became the religion of empire. When faith assumes it deserves power, it forgets how to live without it. Another subtle shift occurred in how free will was discussed. Early Christian thought held tension between divine sovereignty and human responsibility. After Constantine, theological debates increasingly leaned toward systems that emphasized control, order, and predictability. This mirrored imperial administration. God was described in ways that resembled an emperor governing reality from above, rather than a relational being inviting participation. Again, this does not make these ideas automatically false. It reveals how cultural context shapes theology. When believers forget this, they mistake interpretation for revelation. For engagement here, brief and direct. If you believe Scripture should challenge culture rather than echo it, make sure this work continues by supporting and sharing it. As the church grew more powerful, it also grew more distant from the poor. Charity remained a Christian value, but solidarity diminished. Jesus did not merely help the poor, he identified with them. Institutional Christianity often helped from above. This shift preserved social hierarchies while easing conscience. It allowed Christians to feel faithful without being transformed. One of the most tragic outcomes of the Constantinian shift is how persecution was redefined. Christians who once suffered under empire now found themselves persecuting others. Heretics, dissenters, and later entire populations were subjected to violence in the name of Christ. This inversion should haunt any honest reading of history. The uncomfortable truth is that once Christianity learned to survive through power, it forgot how to suffer with integrity. The cross, once a symbol of faithful endurance under injustice, became a justification for enforcing order. Yet even here, the story is not hopeless. Throughout history, voices emerged that resisted this trajectory. Reformers, mystics, and marginalized believers returned again and again to the Gospels, rediscovering a Jesus who did not fit the imperial mold. Their existence proves that Constantine's legacy was influential, not absolute. The question is not whether Constantine single-handedly ruined Christianity. That framing misses the point. The question is whether modern believers are willing to recognize how deeply empire-shaped assumptions still influence what they call biblical. And preserved through historical forces, some sincere, some political, all human. Recognizing this does not destroy faith, it strips it of illusion. And when illusion fades, what remains is either fragile or true. When we finally reach the end of this long historical arc, the most difficult realization is not that Constantine influenced Christianity, but that his influence became invisible. It disappeared into tradition, into habit, into what later generations were taught was simply how it has always been. Power is most effective when it no longer has to announce itself. By the time modern Christianity took shape, the Constantinian framework felt natural, even biblical, despite being largely foreign to the world of Jesus and the apostles. What Constantine ultimately changed was not just church structure or theology, but expectation. He altered what Christians expected faith to look like in the world. Instead of anticipating marginality, believers came to expect dominance. Instead of preparing for resistance, they prepared for relevance. Instead of trusting truth to persuade, they trusted authority to enforce. This shift quietly redefined success. A large, powerful, socially influential church came to be seen as evidence of God's favor, even though Jesus repeatedly warned against that very assumption. This is why modern Christianity struggles so deeply with suffering, decline, and loss of cultural power. A faith shaped by empire does not know how to exist without it. When Christianity loses political influence, many interpret it as failure rather than as a return to its original condition. But the New Testament never promises dominance. It promises faithfulness. Looking back honestly, Constantine did not create Christian belief, but he standardized Christian identity. He helped turn a movement centered on following Jesus into a system centered on belonging to an institution. That distinction matters more than it first appears. Movements invite transformation. Institutions prioritize preservation. Both have their place, but confusing them produces distortion. This is where many people feel betrayed when they begin to uncover church history. They are not losing faith in God or Jesus. They are losing faith in the story they were told about how Christianity came to be. That story often implied divine inevitability, as if every doctrinal decision and institutional development descended directly from heaven. History tells a more human story, one of compromise, debate, fear, sincerity, and power. Here is the final reflection question, and it brings everything together. If Jesus were walking among modern churches today, would he recognize the faith built in his name as an extension of his teachings, or as something that grew around them? The Gospels suggest he would ask uncomfortable questions, not offer easy approval. And that is not a threat to faith, it is an invitation back to it. Constantine's Christianity emphasized certainty. Jesus' way emphasizes trust. Constantine's system relied on control. Jesus' kingdom grows through surrender. Constantine fused God with empire. Jesus separated God from every empire by refusing to become one. Understanding this does not require abandoning Christianity. It requires disentangling Jesus from the layers added around him. It requires returning to Scripture not as a weapon to defend tradition, but as a witness that can challenge it. It requires the humility to admit that sincerity does not guarantee accuracy, and that faithfulness sometimes means unlearning. Modern Christianity often claims continuity with the early church, but continuity is not sameness. The early Christians had no political power, no centralized authority, no creeds enforced by law, and no expectation of cultural dominance. What they had was conviction, community, and a dangerous loyalty to a crucified Messiah. That loyalty changed lives and eventually changed history, not through force, but through faithfulness. The tragedy is not that Constantine supported Christianity. The tragedy is that Christianity learned to equate support with truth. Once that equation was made, everything else followed naturally. Coercion, fear-based teaching, rigid boundaries, and the silencing of dissent. These were not accidents, they were consequences. Yet the story does not end with Constantine, nor does it end with institutional Christianity. It ends wherever people return to the words and way of Jesus with open eyes. The Bible, read honestly, still resists empire. It still challenges religious authority. It still elevates the lowly and unsettles the powerful. It has not lost its voice, it has been drowned out. What your channel exists to do, whether explicitly stated or not, is to lower the volume of tradition so Scripture can be heard again. Not filtered through centuries of power, but encountered on its own terms. That is not rebellion. That is reverence. So did Constantine create modern Christianity? In structure, largely yes. In theology, indirectly. In tone, unquestionably. But he did not create Jesus, and he did not own the gospel. Those remain stubbornly resistant to control. The final engagement, kept simple and honest. If you believe faith should be grounded in truth rather than tradition, in Scripture rather than power, support and share this work so others can begin asking these questions without fear. The uncovering does not destroy belief. It removes the scaffolding built around it. And once that scaffolding falls, what remains is either an illusion or something strong enough to stand on its own. That is the real test of faith.